Starting lecture 10, and this will also be a 4-part lecture. Last time we were looking at Manet and realism during the 1860s. During that time, Manet represented real rebellion, and he caught the eye of all of these experimental artists there in Paris, including those guys right there. They, in the next decade, would become the Impressionists. So the Impressionists had their eyes on Manet during the 60s, and when they became mature artists in the 1870s, they took over the cutting edge of experimentation. There were two co-founders of Impressionism, Monet, not Manet, and Renoir. And look, the Impressionists knew better than to even try to get into the Paris Salon, that kiss of death that was directed to any dissension, any experimentation. They knew they would never get over that hurdle. So look at what they did, and this is important. They rented out their own space. It was an old studio of a famous Parisian photographer. And they put paintings on the wall. And they printed up their own exhibition catalog and simply invited the public to come and see their artwork. And when did this occur? It was in 1874. So the first Impressionist exhibit was 1874. The last was 12 years later in 1886. So here, Impressionism became the cutting edge of experimentation in Paris during the 1870s. And look at what the Impressionists started. They introduced the concept of an alternative exhibition space. Prior to that time in Paris, the only place you had to show your art was through the salon. But these real inventive rebels decided, no, we're just going to bypass the salon, and not be subject to their whims and their prejudices. We're going to start our own alternative exhibition space and have the public to come and see our work if the public wants to come. So look, and here's the quiz question. By the end of the 19th century, there were several alternative exhibition spaces there in Paris. And the Impressionists in 1874 started that whole process. That's very important. Yeah, so look, those are two paintings, a salon landscape on the left and an Impressionist painting on the right. And, why does Impressionism look so different from previous landscapes? Impressionists were predominantly landscape painters. And we're going to look at two of the reasons. First, we remember that prior to the 19th century, landscape artists painted indoors. We saw that with the Dutch artists, right? They would refer to their sketchbooks and then transfer those visual notes to their canvas and sort of paint from memory and imagination. Despite how naturalistic it looked, they were still painting inside of their studios. In contrast, the Impressionists actually set up their easels outside. And here is a painting by Renoir of Monet painting a rose garden outside. So what this is called, this practice of painting outdoors, is called open air painting, or plein air, which is French for open air. So open air painting is something that the Impressionists popularized during their exhibitions because the public saw the results. And open air painting was one reason why the Impressionists had such different looking artwork. Impressionism popularized open-air painting. Now listen, so the salon painters did not practice this open-air painting. And why did the Impressionists go outside? It's because of their color usage. They did not want to be confined to local color, the color that the head sees. They wanted to go out and see the colors of nature, perceptual color. And we've seen this dichotomy before. So here on the left, that guy in the studio, he's confined to local color. He thinks trees are always green. But the Impressionists go outside and they want to record that instantaneous encounter with nature. And they wanted to note all the variations of the colors of nature, the perceptual colors. So their paintings look far different from the studio work of previous landscapists. Another huge factor, the more important factor, is color theory. Now, color theory had been around for, 100 years, but it's the Impressionists that really embraced it. They studied it and they used its principles. And we're just going to look at a couple of things that I want you to be aware of. Color theory is how the eye perceives colors and the interaction of colors. And according to color theory, there are what's called 3 primary colors: yellow, red, and blue. Primary because you can't make those up out of a combination of other colors. You got to start with those 3 colors. And then you have 3 secondary colors. Those colors you do make up. They're a 50-50 blend of adjacent primary colors. Look at this. Right there, yellow, primary, red, primary, 50-50 part. You bring them together and you have orange. Orange is a secondary color. This is how you create green, 50% yellow, 50% blue, and how you mix violet, a mixture of red and blue. More importantly, though, is the concept of complementary colors. Complementary colors, what we got up there? Complementary colors are opposite colors on the color wheel. So red and green are complementary colors because they are opposite to one another on the color wheel. So complementary really means opposite. And you can see which colors are complementary by their oppositions. And that's one reason why we have the color wheel in the shape of a wheel. So you can easily see the opposite color. So red and green are opposite, therefore complementary colors of one another. Opposite colors intensify each other. Just like black and white opposites intensify one another, in color theory, the theory is complementary colors also intensify each other. So when you juxtapose red and green, they mutually simultaneously contrast with one another. And the green makes the red look as vibrant as possible, and the red makes the green look as green as possible. Now, when this occurs, the term is simultaneous contrast. Complementary colors are simultaneously contrasting each other's characteristics, value, hue. And this simultaneous contrast is like one of the main underlying principles of color theory. So simultaneous contrast intensifies complementary colors. So when you go to a grocery store and you look at those little red tomatoes there, they're almost always packaged in green. Why is that? It's because the green is the opposite of red, and the green makes the red tomatoes look as ripe as possible. You encounter the principle of simultaneous contrast all over advertisement. Another simultaneous contrast is violet and yellow. So listen, in simultaneous contrast, you're going to have a primary color contrasted with a secondary color. You see how that works out? The primary is always opposite a secondary color. And here, this is exactly what Monet did in his landscapes. He predominantly used in his palette complementary colors. In this case, we have violet and yellow. And man, they do just like, they have the brilliance of sunlight behind the canvas because those colors cannot be more intense than we see them there because of the principle of simultaneous contrast. Another example is orange and blue. So a secondary and a primary, opposite colors, make up simultaneous contrast, and Monet and all the Impressionists knew this. And here we have, in a very toned down application, an orange and blue palette, and it does capture the brilliance of sunlight. And that is one main reason, color theory and simultaneous contrast, why salon painting looked so different from the new Impressionist paintings. And salon artists were not interested in color theory. It was the Impressionists that really embraced that new science and subsequently popularized it. So if we step back, it's like well before Impressionism, in the middle of the 19th century, the art establishment, when the powers to be said there are only two paths, Romanticism and academic classicism, but then walks in Manet and realism. And he basically said, all right, maybe there's actually three alternatives. That was the real starting point of the revolution, the artistic revolution. And now, and that revolution really picks up speed as we get closer and closer to the 20th century. And now we see Impressionism come in, and they're saying, hey, maybe there's actually more than three viable alternatives, artistic paths. Now, look, yeah, these guys look different there, but what really caught the imagination of experimental artists was how brilliant the color usage was with the Impressionists. And that was all due, we just saw, to color theory. And color theory becomes the biggest influence of Impressionism on subsequent modernist movements. Color theory was Impressionism's biggest influence because it was a major breakthrough, really opened the door for artists. So here, back to that painting there, open air painting, painting outside, recording the perceptual color that the artist sees. It's all about recording nature as the human eye perceives it and put it down on the canvas, without really altering your vision. Now, some artists, however, that initially were associated with Impressionism felt that that was a little too much like being human cameras. Like, these new breed of artists did not simply want to be Impressionists because Impressionists simply were recording human vision. Who wants to be a human camera, a machine? They wanted to use their art to express something other than visual perception. So these artists rejected the goals of Impressionism to faithfully record your instantaneous impression of nature outside. They wanted to go beyond the style, the technique, the technology of Impressionism. And they became the Post-Impressionists. Post-Impressionism means after Impressionism, which means they took a lot of the principles, especially color theory, that Impressionism introduced, but took that toolbox to a higher level to explore other artistic goals and interests. So now we're looking at Post-Impressionism. Before we get there, let's touch base with the time frame here. So realism starts right around 1850, and in the 1860s is when Manet was at his strongest. And then comes the 1870s, where we just were, and that was dominated by Impressionism as far as cutting-edge experimentation goes. I mean, the salon was still very much in power. And now, starting right around 1880 to the end of the century, so for those 2 decades, we have the main period of Post-Impressionism. By 1900, most of the Post-Impressionists were dead. So, starting right around 1880, going to the end of the century, is the main period for Post-Impressionism. That might be a quiz question. We are going to look at 3 Post-Impressionists, starting with the Frenchman, Paul Gauguin. And we'll look at him next time.